Hi, family. I'm going to be reading The Science and Fine Art of Fasting by Herbert M Shelton. It was written in 1934. He talks about the physiology of fasting and just everything you need to know because, there are so many of our brothers and sisters who think that it's dangerous to fast, and I know there's a lot of misinformation out there, and that's why I really want to speak on that. And just give me 1 second, because I do want to invite people in. So hold on, let me just share it to our group. Hold on. I'm just inviting people um, into this live, just sharing it to the small group. It's about The Science and Fine Art of Fasting by Herbert M Shelton. It was written in 1934, and he really explains how it's actually really good for our body, and not just, we all know the spiritual aspects of it, but he goes into pretty good details about just everything that just of what our bodies are going to experience. So oh sorry, it's my store. Shalom, family. Okay, yeah, I'm going to be reading from Herbert M Shelton, The Science and Art of Fasting. It's actually from 1934, so this information has been around for a long time, almost 91 years. So yeah, it's been around for a while. So I'm just going to read right now. Okay, here we go. For copyright reasons, I don't want to show the cover because I don't want to have any problems with that. Okay, the definition of fasting. Nutrition may be conveniently divided into two phases, positive and negative, and corresponding to periods of eating and periods of abstaining from food. Negative nutrition has received the term fasting, inanition, starvation. Fasting and starving and separate phenomena will demarked from each other. Inanition covers both these processes. Fast is derived from the Anglo-Saxon word fast, which means firm or fixed. The practice of going without food at a certain time was called fasting. From the Anglo-Saxon, fasten, to hold oneself from food. Like most English words, the word fasting has more than one meaning. Thus, the dictionary defines fasting as abstinence from food, partial or total, or from prescribed kinds of food. In most religious fast, abstinence from prescribed foods is all that is meant. We may define it thus: fasting is abstention, entirely or in part, and for longer or shorter periods of time from food and drink, or from food alone. A misuse of the term fasting is quite common. I refer to the use of the word fasting when a particular diet is referred to. We read and hear of fruit fast, water fast, milk fast, etc. When talking of a fruit diet, a milk diet, etc., a fruit fast is abstinence from fruit. A milk fast is abstinence from milk. A water fast is abstinence from water. The dictionary defines a diet as a regulated course of eating and drinking, a specially prescribed regimen. The daily fare, victuals, allowance of food, rations. To diet is to regulate or restrict the food and drink according to a regimen, to eat carefully or sparingly, to take food to eat. Fasting, as we employ the term, is voluntary and entire abstinence from all food except water. Little dribble meals, says Dr. Chaz E. Page, are not fasting. There should not be a mouthful or sip of anything but water, a few swallows of which would be taken from time to time according to desire. We do not employ the word fasting to describe a diet of fruit juice, for example. Inanition is a technical term literally meaning emptiness, which is applied to all forms and stages of abstinence from food and many forms of malnutrition due to various causes, even though the person is eating. Professor Morgulis classifies 3 types of inanition according to origin as follows. 1. Physiological inanition, which is a normal, regular occurrence in nature. The inanition constitutes either a definite phase in the life cycle of the animal, it is a seasonal event, or it accompanies the periodic recurrence of sexual activity. The cases of the salmon and seal and of hibernating animals are examples of this. It gets better. It's just, this is like, yeah. But, I mean, if you want to learn, and I'm telling you what, when you fast, you will never feel better. Never. Okay. 2, pathological inanition, which is in various degrees of severity associated with different organic derangements, obstruction of the alimentary canal, esophageal stricture, inability to retain food, vomiting, excessive destruction of body tissue, infectious fevers, and refusal to take food either because of loss of appetite or mental disease. Accidental or experimental inanition in this category, of course, belong all individual experiences which have been the subject of carefully conducted scientific investigation. To this should be added a 4th classification, a class with which Professor Morgulis seems to be very largely unacquainted, which is largely or wholly voluntary, but in which abstinence from food is not for mere experimental purposes, but for the promotion or restoration of health. I prefer to call this hygienic fasting. Others refer to it as therapeutic fasting. Fasting of this type is not wholly voluntary in acute disease, except in the sense that all instinctive action is voluntarily. It is the hygienic fast that we are chiefly concerned with with this volume, although we are going to make use of data gained from the other types of fasting that may be of service to us in better understanding and more intelligently conducting a fast. In his Inanition and Malnutrition, Jackson says the term starvation is more frequently used to indicate the extreme stages of inanition leading to death. Unfortunately, this is too often not the case. Too often the term starvation is applied to the whole period of abstinence from food from the first day to the end, until the end in death. Carrington says, many doctors speak of the fasting or starvation cure, which simply shows that they don't know what they are talking about. Fasting is an absolutely different thing from starvation. One is beneficial, the other harmful. One is a valuable therapeutic measure, the other is a death-dealing experiment. Physical Culture, May 1915. A distinction must be made between fasting and starving, as well as will be seen as our study proceeds. Fasting is not starving. The difference between fasting and starving is immense and well demarcated. Dr. Hazard expressed this fact in these words: starvation results from food denial, either by accident or design. To a system clamoring for sustenance, fasting consists in intentional abstinence from food by a system suffering from disease and non-desirous sustenance until rested, cleansed, and ready for the labor of digestion. I'm going to try a different angle because it's very hard to read like this. Sorry, family. Let me see if I can do it better this way. Hope you guys can read it. Fasting is neither a hunger cure nor a starvation cure, as it is sometimes called. Fasting is not starving. The fasting person is not hungry, and fasting is not a method or treating or cure disease. Dr. Page says the term frequently applied starvation cure is both misleading and disheartening to the patient. The fact is, he is both starved and poisoned by eating when the hope of digestion and assimilation is prohibited, as is in great measure the case in all acute attacks, and more especially when there is nausea or lack of appetite. Fasting is a rest, a physiological vacation, not an ordeal nor a penance. It is a house cleaning measure deserving to be better known and more widely used. This is Dr. Herbert M Shelton, The Science and Fine Art of Fasting. It was originally published in 1934. I just can't show the cover because of the copyright, but I'm just using, this is his, his words. Fasting among the lower animals. In the study of fasting, it is necessary that we approach the subject from many angles. Perhaps no subject is less understood by the public and the healing professions than this oldest of means of caring for the sick body. We are justified in studying every phenomenon which may throw light upon the sick. What? It don't seem right. Sick. The fasting habits of man and animals are all legitimate objects of study. Not alone the fasting practice of sick animals, but fasting in healthy animals, whether voluntary or enforced, will aid us in more clearly understanding this subject. Particularly will such a study aid in us overcoming our cultivated fear of fasting, hence the following studies. The more one attempts to find out about the habits of modes of living of animals, the more one is impressed with the paucity of our dependable accumulated knowledge of the animal kingdom. Our biologists seem to be more intent upon classification than upon the important phases of life. If they study an animal, they prefer to kill it and dissect it, perhaps to mount it and place it in a case. They are more intent upon a study of death than of life. All unconsciously, perhaps, they have converted biology into necrology. I have, however, after much searching, succeeded in accumulating a considerable amount of material about fasting habits of many animals. This I here propose to discuss under fasting during the mating season. That some animals fast during the mating season is well known, but our knowledge of the living habitat of animal kingdoms is so meager that it is not known how many animals do so. So far as it is at present known, fasting during the breeding season is very rare among mammals and birds. Among mammals, where there is keen competition between the males for possession of the females, feeding is curtailed, but this is hardly a fast. Quite a number of fishes fast during the breeding season. The female of the Clichda or mouth breeders must fast at this time. See History of Fishes by J.R. Norman. The best known example of fasting by fish during the mating season is that of the long fast of the male salmon. Professor Margulis described in these words the annual fast of the salmon. At the time they commence to migrate from the sea towards the streams. Their muscles are thoroughly encumbered with huge masses of fat. Fasting all their journey, which lasts many weeks and months, they are in much emaciated condition when they get up to the upper reaches of the rivers where the currents are rough and swift. Freed from the fat, however, their muscles are now agile and nimble, and it is at this time that the salmon displays the marvelous endurance and skills admired by all sportsmen in progressing steadily against all odds of the tumultuous current, waterfalls, and obstructions. Penguins and the male goose are the only birds I find mentioned as fasting during the mating season. The gander loses about 1/4 of his body weight during this period. George C. Goodwin, Associate Curator, Department of Mammals, the American Museum of Natural History, New York, says it is questionable if any of the birds are capable of a prolonged fast. The rate of metabolism is too high. I have never heard that a gander fasted during the mating season, and am inclined to question such a statement. The basis of his questioning is not very solid. He has never heard of it. It may be assumed that if it were true, he would have heard of it, but no man knows everything in biology, and this is out of his special field. The other part of his objection, the high rate of metabolism of birds, is no basis at all. It only reveals that he knows little of fasting. It is not likely that the rate of metabolism of the male salmon is low while he swims hundreds of miles upstream. His is a priori doubts must be considered. They are not to be taken as final. The Alaskan fur seal bull is the best known example of fasting by a mammal. During the mating season, I have no information on the rate of metabolism in this mammal, but I think we are safe in assuming that since he is a warm-blooded animal and at the same time extremely active during the whole of the fasting period, his metabolic rate is high. During the entire 3 months breeding season of each year, the Alaskan fur bull seal does not eat or drink, although within each reach of abundant food, from May or the middle of June to the end of July or early days of August. After fighting for his place on the shores and for his harem of from 5 to 60 females, the male seal spends the summer fighting to keep his harem together and to keep his girls satisfied. Sorry, family. I just think that's funny. Ray Chapman Andrews says in his End of the Earth, all through the summer, he neither eats nor sleeps. It is just one long debauch of fighting and lovemaking and guarding his harem against unscrupulous invaders. As a result of all this activity, Mr. Andrews says that by September he is a wreck of his former self. All his fat has disappeared, for that is what he has been living on by absorption all summer. His bones protrude, his side is torn and scarred, he is weary unto death. Blessed sleep is what he needs. Forsaking his harem, he waddles back into the long grass far away from the beach. There too, stretch out the warm sun, he will sleep for 3 weeks or on end without waking, if undisturbed. After long months of incessant physical and sexual activity without food, the seal thinks first of rest and sleep. Food may be had after the long sleep. With man also, despite popular prejudices to the contrary, there are times when rest is of more importance than food. The seal lion also fasts during the mating season, although less tempestuous. The domestic life of the sea lion is described as being very similar to that of the fur seal. Coming ashore sometimes between the middle of May and early June, the summer is spent in fasting and sexual activities. By the end of summer, the master of the harem is exhausted and has lost much weight, but is still able to wearily slip down the sloping beach into the sea, where a few months of fat living restore his emaciated form. The exertions of these sea lions, both sexual and physical, as they fight much, is described as tremendous. I have no information as to whether they, like the fur seal bull, go without water during this period. What may be regarded as fasting during the mating season is the phenomenon seen among many insects which have but a short adult life. The caterpillar does little else than eat. In certain species, after it becomes a butterfly, it never eats at all. Faber showed that some insects have no provision for hunger, the digestive organs being absent in the fullest developed insects. Perhaps such short-lived species and ephemera should not be considered in this connection. These insects come into the world in the evening, mate, the female lays her eggs, and by morning both sexes are dead without ever having seen the sun. Destined for little else than reproduction, they have no mouth and do not eat, neither do they drink. But the peacock butterfly, which often travels for miles in search of a mate and lives for a few days, though it has the merest semblance of digestive apparatus, does not eat. The insect would present us with many examples of this kind. Pupal sleep. The pupal stage of insects which undergo metamorphosis is that immediately following the larva stage. The term chrysalis has almost the same value as pupa. If the insect is not wholly quiescent during this pupal stage, the word nymph is used. Since the larva stage of most insects differs so markedly from the adult stage, the pupal stage constitutes the intermediate stage in which the necessary bodily changes are effected. It is a period of internal transformation during which most pupa are outwardly quiescent. They move very little and do not eat at all. The marvelous structural and functional transformation take place during this period of abstinence from food. The pupa, depending entirely upon its stored reserve for the accomplishment of its structural revolution, pupal sleep may be artificially prolonged. Shalom, family. Fasting after birth. Fasts for longer or shorter durations are seen in many animals immediately after birth. For example, Faber tells us that certain spiders eat no food for the first 6 months of their lives, but feast upon sunbeams. Chickens take neither food nor water for the first 3 days after they hatch from the egg. In most mammals, there is no milk secreted for 3 or more days after their young are born. The fluid secreted during this period is devoid of food value. Fasting when not hungry. Many animals normally go for long periods between feedings, not eating for the reason that they are not hungry. For example, there are many snakes that eat only at long intervals. Fasting when angry or excited. An animal will refuse food when angry or excited. Indeed, an animal that is hungry and in the process of eating may be angered and will cease eating. Angry animals do not resume eating again until their anger has subsided. Reports of dogs grieving over the absence or death of their owners refusing food for long periods are often carried by the press. Fasting in captivity. Some animals refuse to eat when held in captivity. They will starve to death rather than live as captives, thus making good Patrick Henry's ringing cry, "Give me liberty or give me death." One of these is the famous marine iguana, Amblyrymchus, cristaceus, a seashore lizard of the Galapagos Island, described as the vegetarian dragon and fasting man. The iguana feeds on seaweeds and can abstain from food for long periods over 100 days. Experimental fast. Many thousands of animals of all kinds have been employed in experimental fast. Insects, fishes, snakes, birds, rodents, rabbits, badgers, cows, horses, and many other types of animals have been used in fasts of varying lengths of time. In many of these fasts, the period of abstinence from food has been extended far beyond the normal limits of the fast into the period of starvation, some of them being ended before death occurred, others being carried on to death. While we are opposed to the suffering caused in animals by publishing the period of abstinence beyond the return of hunger, it has been done, and the information thus obtained is available, and we are at liberty to make use of it in our studies of the subject. Many of these experimental fasts will be referred to as we proceed in our study. Fasting when wounded. Biologists, physiologists, and research workers of all kinds are very fond of animal experimentation, but all of these workers are in the habit of ignoring important parts of the regular activities of animals. For example, they ignore, never mention, in fact, the numerous instances of dogs and other animals having fasted 10, 20, or more days when they have received internal injuries or a broken bone. That a sick animal refused food is well known to all laymen, but physiologists and biologists seem to think that this fact is unworthy even of mentioning. Can we not learn from observing the normal and regular activities of animals living normal lives? Must we assume that animals are capable of teaching us something only when under artificial conditions and subjected to processes that they never encountered in the normal course of their existence? Dr. Oswald tells of a dog that had been put into the loft of a barn by the sergeant of a cavalry regiment. Losing its balance While the door of the loft and barking, it fell, turning a few somersaults as it came down and landed on the hard pavement with a crack that seemed that had broken every bone in his body. He says blood was trickling from his mouth and nose when we picked him up, and the troopers advised me to put him out of his misery. But he was my little brother's pet, and after some hesitation, I decided to take him home in a basket and give the problem of his care and the benefit of a fractional chance. Investigation proved that he had broken 2 legs and 3 ribs, and judging by the way he raised his head and gasped for air every now and then, it seemed probably that his lungs had been injured. For 20 days and 20 nights, the little terrier stuck to life in its cotton-lined basket without touching a crumb of solid food, but ever ready to take a few drops of water. In preference even to milk or soup. At the end of the 3rd week, it broke its fast with a sauceful of sweet milk, but only on the evening of the 26th day did it begin to betray any interest in a plateful of meat scraps. Erwin Leach, noted German physician and surgeon, tells of instinctive fasting in three of his dogs. One of these had been run over by a truck while had broken several bones and injured it internally. The other had devoured considerable quantity of rat poison. It became very, very ill, suffered from diarrhea containing blood and pus, and collapsed completely. The 3rd lost an eye while mixing it with a cat. All 3 of these dogs fasted and recovered. Physiologists have persistently ignored cases where dogs have voluntarily Shalom, family. Where dogs have voluntarily fasted for 10 or 20 or more days when suffering from broken bones or internal injuries. Here is an action invariably pursued by nature, which they persist in refusing to investigate. It is said that the elephant, if wounded and still able to travel, will go along with the rest of the herd and can be found supporting itself beside a tree while the remainder of the herd enjoys a hearty meal. The wounded elephant is totally oblivious to the excellent food all around him. He obeys an instinct as unerring as the one that brings to the bee to his hive, an instinct which is common to the whole animal world, many included. Fasting in disease. I need but devote little space to a discussion of what everyone already knows, namely that the sick animal refused all food. The farmer knows that his foundered horse will not eat, is off his feed, as he expresses it. The sick cat, dog, cow, or other animals refuse food. Animals will abstain from food when sick for days and weeks, refusing all food that may be offered them until they are well. Dr. Felix Oswald says, serious sickness prompts all animals to fast. Wounded deer will retire to some secluded den and starve for weeks together. Dr. Erwin Leach endorses fasting and observes that small children and animals, guided by an infallible instinct, limit to the utmost their intake of food if they are sick or injured. Arthur Brisbane disapproved of fasting and took Mr. Sinclair to task for advocating it. After a lengthy correspondence about the matter, Mr. Brisbane acknowledged that even dogs fast when they are ill. Sinclair retorted, I look forward to the time when human beings may be as wise as dogs. A dog or cat, if sick or wounded, will crawl under the woodshed or retire to some other secluded spot and rest and fast until well. Occasionally, he will come out for water. These animals will, when wounded or sick, persistently refuse the most tempting food when offered to them. Physical and physiological rest and water are their remedies. A sick cow or horse will also refuse food. The author has seen this in many hundreds of cases. In fact, all nature obeys this instinct. Thus does nature teach us that the way to feed in acute disease is not to do it. Domestic cattle may often be found suffering from some chronic disease. Such animals invariably consume less food than the normal animal. Every stockman knows that when a cow or horse or hog or sheep, etc., persistently refuse food or day after day consume much less than normally, there is something wrong with that animal. Food scarcity. I need devote but little space to the fact that animals fast for shorter or longer periods in time of food scarcity with floods, droughts, storms, etc., destroy their food supplies, or when snow has covered their food and rendered it temporarily inaccessible. It often happens in the lives of animals that they are forced to go for days at a time without food for the reason that they cannot find it. Then sometimes, though relatively rarely, perhaps go so long without food that they die of starvation. Luckily, they possess sufficient reserves to enable them to go without food for prolonged periods and survive. Animals that enter the winter season with considerable fat commonly emerge from winter rather thin due to the fact that they are forced to subsist or greatly reduce food supplies and often have to go for days at a time without food. Even at the height of the food season, insects may so completely destroy the food supply that many animals are forced to go for considerable periods without food. Fasting and accidental imprisonment. A number of accidental emergencies force both domestic and wild animals to fast at times. How frequently such accidents occur in nature, we are not in a position to say, but they are probably more frequently than we may suppose. In his Curiosities of Instinct, Carl Vogt tells of the case of a spaniel which visitors had accidentally locked up in the attic of an old castle ruin. The dog had been able to secure a few drops of water by gnawing the edge of a cleft in a slate-covered roof. A few heavy rain showers had supplied him with water, but he had no food of any kind, no grain, leather, rats, or mice during the whole summer and part of the autumn. A picnic on the Castle Mount during the first week in October resulted in his rescue by a wandering party of sightseers. The ribs of the little prisoner, who had been locked up since the middle of June, could be counted as easily as in a skeleton, but he was still able to drag himself across the floor and lick the hands of his deliverers. Oh. The following account of Bum appeared in Time for April 27, 1931, when Joseph Carroll, engineer of a Brooklyn laundry, heard the Negro night watchman tell of a ghost he had heard one night last week. He walked into the engine room and straight to a boarded up hole in the floor, relic of an unsuccessful well digging. Stopping his ears, holding a knife in his teeth, he touched the knife to a pipe which went downward. Presently, he could hear a distant moaning. He knew what was in the hole. Early in January, he had found and adopted a mongrel puppy, But after a few days, the puppy, which he called Bum, disappeared. The same day, the hole over the excavation had been boarded up securely. The engine's noise must have drowned the dog's cries ever since. Shalom, family. Hastily, engineer Carroll ripped up the board, descended, brought Bum, a skeletal dog, unable to stand alone, to the surface. No local veterinary would believe that a dog could have fasted for 14 weeks. Some thought Bum must have lived by rat catching, some cried. Impossible. Local veterinarians were as ignorant of fasting as was a medical man who was once roundly scored a woman who had undertaken to fast under my direction after he and several of his big-priced colleagues, specialists and medical professors, had declared they did not know and could not find out what her trouble was and could do nothing for her. He declared that if she went 60 days without food, her heart would collapse and she would die. She had 2 fasts, one of 12 days, the other of 13, and recovered her health. The doctor came crawling back some 3 months later and apologized for his ungentlemanly and unprofessional conduct. I had been reading up on these cases, and I find that in Germany they are using fasting in them with excellent success, he said. An Associated Press dispatch from Warsaw, Indiana, dated December 31st, 1931, tells of a sow surviving 4.5 months without food, buried under an avalanche of straw on the Oscar Redmond farm east of Warsaw on July 15th. While threshing was in progress, she remained buried until December 30th. When workmen who were pulling out straw heard a grunt and were surprised to see the sow walk out minus about half of her former weight. This was a period of 168 days without food and water. The great blizzard of 49 was so terrible that many men, women, and children, and much livestock in the west froze to death. Many sheep froze around the haystacks. Unusually heavy snows fell, and in some places remained for long periods. The snow was deep and animals were buried. Several reports of animals being buried deep in the snow for long periods were published. These are of special interest to us here for the reason that these buried animals were deprived of food and of all possibility of obtaining food by the snow that covered them. An Associated Press dispatch from Rapid City, South Dakota, tells of a pig found 54 days after the blizzard in that state. The dispatch says that before the blizzard of January 2nd, 1949 struck, Jess Sparks, a farmer who lived northwest of Rapid City, had 21 pigs. After the storm was over, he could find but 20 of his pigs. He gave up as lost the missing pig. 40 days after the snowstorm had buried the pig, Mr. Sparks heard a grunt. Digging through several feet of snow, he soon released the pig, which walked out under its own power and, although very thin, did not resume eating at once. A similar incident was reported by Jack Stott of Cody, Wyoming, who dug out a straw stack that had been buried 20 feet deep for 63 days and found 2 Hereford heifers, a little wobbly but otherwise in good condition. John Lemke, a farmer in Super, South Dakota, dug out a sow that had been buried for 3 months. At the time of her burial, she weighed 300 pounds. She was skinny when rescued, but able to walk 3/4 of a mile to a feed trail. on the William Brandt farm near Fort Morgan, Colorado, a sheep was found alive on February 12, 1949, after having been entombed in a snowdrift for 40 days, having been hemmed against a high board fence by the big blizzard that struck in early January. A companion sheep was dead. The two sheep had eaten away a small portion of a wooded fence. Other than this, they had no food while buried in the snow. These are examples of burial of domestic animals. Wild animals must also frequently be buried by the snow and must remain for shorter or longer periods in their prisons. How many examples of burials similar to the foregoing burials of domestic animals that blizzards would have afforded had they been recorded, we can only surmise. As the snow of the blizzard blanketed many thousands of square miles of territory, wildlife could not have escaped it. Small animals especially were buried. They were forced to live without eating during their burial. The ability of an animal to fast for long periods under such conditions means the difference between surviving and perishing. Rabbits are well known to be frequently buried in the snow. If we could know just how often such things occur in nature, and how many hundreds of thousands of animals are thus forced to go without food for considerable periods each year, we would probably find that the ability to fast is a very important means of survival. Hibernation. All animals adapt themselves in some manner to the winter season. Winter is a difficult period for many plants and animals in northern countries. With its short days, low temperatures, stormy weather, scarcity of food, both animals and plants are faced with the problem of keeping alive under very unfavorable circumstances. Both animals and plants have found many solutions to the problem, adapting themselves to winter in a wide variety of ways. Migration, as by birds, is but one of many solutions animals have found for the perplexing problem. Birds that migrate may lead a life as active in their southern homes as they do in their northern homes in the spring and summer. This is not so of animals that do not migrate. Some animals store away supplies of food for this period. Bees store up honey, squirrels store away nuts, the mouse stores away food in various caches. The beaver stores twigs, gopher and chipmunk store up roots and nuts on which they feed when they awaken on an occasional warm day. On the colder days, they sleep and take no food. This is to say, many animals that store away food in various caches fast much during the winter months. Other animals store their food supplies within themselves. These internal food supplies serve the animal as well as do the caches of food stored outside. As the food stored outside the body by other animals. We may say then that some animals store up their winter food supply within themselves. Hibernation by those animals that depend upon internal stores during the winter season is the solution for the exogenesis of winter that has been adopted by many forms of life than any other solution. Bats, mites, hedgehogs, woodchucks, toads, newts, lizards, snakes, snails, flies, wasps, bees, and the great host of insects, bears, crocodiles, alligators, and many other animals do not migrate, but go into winter quarters. Animals that store up food outside themselves also carry internal supplies, for they too are often forced to go for extended periods without food. Squirrels, for example, frequently forget where they have buried their stores of nuts. Hibernation is a dormant state of existence accompanied by greatly diminished respiration, circulation, and metabolism, in which animals in the temperate regions spend the winter. During this period, the animal functions are nearly suspended. The body heat is lowered to or nearly that of the air. The action of the heart is much reduced, and the animal loses from 30 to 40% of its weight. During hibernation, the mammal may not feed, depending entirely on the stored food reserves within the body. The evidence at hand indicates that in such instances, the body weight may drop as much as 50%. Indeed, in bats, it drops more than this. In other animals, food is stored within their winter nests, and the hibernating animal awakens from time to time to consume its food. Writing in the National Geographic magazine, July 1946, under the title Mystery Mammals in Twilight, Donald R. Griffin says that hibernation of bats and other animals is still, in many respects, a mystery to biologists. Mystery or not, it is a common fact of nature and represents one of the means adopted by animals to adapt them to the exigencies of winter. Hibernation is most common in cold-blooded animals that are unable to leave regions of severe winters. But it is also practiced by numerous warm-blooded animals. Some biologists say that the term hibernation should be restricted to a few mammals and prefer the phase lying low and saying nothing, like some frogs and fishes, many snails and insects. Other biologists, although seeming to prefer the limit to term hibernate to the winter sleep of warm-blooded animals, also include under this term the seasonal torpidity of frogs, toads, reptiles, certain fishes, insects, the horseshoe crab, and snails. Among the many different forms of lying low seen in the winter life of an animal are: 1. The relapsed life of some insects, pupae, where the body of the larva, example maggot, has been greatly simplified in structure, in fact, almost embryonic again. 2. The arrested development of other insect larvae, such as caterpillars and pupae, where the metamorphosis into the winged form has ceased for the time being, like a stopped watch. 3. The suspended animation of small creature like bear animalcules, some of them quaintly like microscopic hippopotami and wheel animalcules, and small threadworms in which we can detect no vitality for the time being. The comatose state of snails and frogs, where we can see the heart beating through the life of the body as a whole, is at very low ebb. 5. The state of true hibernation, restricted to a few mammals such as the hedgehog and dormouse, marmot, and bat. This is a particular state very, very unlike normal sleep. Most of the animals' vital functions, even excretion, are in abeyance, with the heart being very feebly and the breathing movements scarcely perceptible. In all of these forms of lying low, the animals hide away and cease their activities and approach a state of suspended animation during the winter months. General tendency of animals to withdraw hibernation, so common among animals, appears then to be one aspect of the general tendency of animals to withdraw from an unfavorable environment. In hibernation, the animal passes through the unfavorable period of low temperature and food scarcity in a dormant state. Thus, hibernation, like migration, is one of the means of solving the food problem during that period of acute scarcity. Mammals that hibernate are referred to by certain biologists as imperfectly warm-blooded types, which are unable to produce enough animal heat to make good their losses in cold weather. It is doubtful if this is true of those species in which only the female hibernates. Food scarcity rather than depressed temperature seem to be the chief reason for hibernation, as estivation is practically identical with hibernation, one taking place under certain opposite conditions, when it is hot rather than cold, but where, as in hibernation, there is a food scarcity, those mammals that estivate cannot be said to be imperfectly warm-blooded types. The example of the tenor that estivates at the time for estivation, even when far removed from its Madagascar home and placed where the temperature is warm and there is an abundance of food, would seem to indicate that there is more to this phenomenon than merely the external circumstances under which it occurs. Hibernation resembles sleep and has been likened to a trance, but it is not sleep. The hibernating animal does sleep all or most of the time it hibernates, but hibernation is different from sleep. Sleep is not seasonal and is not occasioned by scarcity of food. Hibernation is prolonged and body temperature drops very low in this state, whereas it tends to remain normal in sleep. Heartbeat and respiration are very low in hibernation. They are reduced but slightly in sleep. Excretion is suspended in hibernation and may be increased in sleep. There is great loss of weight during hibernation. In sleep, there may be a gain of tissue. Hibernation is confined to the cold season. Sleep takes place throughout the year, both at night and in the daytime, and lasts for a few minutes to a few hours at a time. Griffin says that the torpor of hibernation is much more prolonged than ordinary sleep. It is correct to refer to hibernation as a comatose condition. Is the animal in a coma? Is the hibernation state one of the torpor, lethargy, stupor? The terms are frequently used by biologists in describing the hibernating conditions. Coma is defined as an abnormal deep stupor occurring in illness or as a result of it. Result of it, such as alcoholic coma, apoplectic coma, uremic coma, diabetic coma, coma vigil, etc. It would be interesting to know what a normal coma is. Stupor is defined as a condition of unconsciousness. Torpor, stupor, a state analog to hypnotism, or the first stage of hypnotism. It is seen in Africa, sleeping sickness, encephalitis, lethargic, hysteria, and other pathological states. Torpor is numbness, abnormal inactivity, dormancy, apathy. Torpid means not acting vigorously, sluggish. Biologists use such terms as coma, comatose, lethargic, stupor, trance, etc. in describing hibernation as though there is something essentially pathological about it. Dormant is perhaps the better word, as the root dor means sleep, although, as previously pointed out, hibernation is not synonymous with sleep. Dormant means being in a state resembling sleep, inactive, unused. The hibernation does resemble sleep in many particulars is certain that the hibernating animal is even more inactive than in sleep is equally true. Perhaps we can define hibernation as a dormant state of existence accompanied with greatly diminished respiration, circulation, and metabolism, which many animals in the temperate regions pass the winter. In hibernation, the animal seeks out a secluded nook or burrow or a cave, whether the temperature is higher than outside, and sinks into strange reptile-like state. There it lies, or as in the case of the bat, hangs in safety through the cold and storm. It eats nothing, it excretes nothing. The heart beats feebly. The breathing movements are scarcely perceptible, yet it survives. Indeed, it seems certain that it would not survive otherwise. Thus, hibernation, viewed biologically, is seen to be an adaptation to the cold of winter, by which the animal is enabled to survive. Danger lies in sub-freezing weather for the hibernating mammal, and many are frozen to death where their place of abode becomes too cold. Griffin says of the bat, another important requirement, also usually satisfied by caves and burrows, is that the temperature should not go below freezing. Apparently, no mammal can survive freezing when it is hibernating, and its body temperature is at the mercy of the surrounding air temperature. He tells of finding bats in caves, the openings of which are great enough to permit freezing, frozen up in huge ice stalaces. Most of the bats, he says, awaken and fly away to another and better sheltered cave when the cave is in which they are hibernating begins to get cold. Hibernation in plants. Perhaps before we give our attention into hibernation among animals, we may profitably take a hasty glance at the hibernating practice of plants. The winter sleep of trees, shrubs, and many other plants it is seen on every hand during winter. With the approach of fall, these shed their leaves, their sap descends, and they exist in a dormant state until the coming of spring. In like manner, bulbs, tubers, etc. undergo a prolonged winter sleep. These plants fast through the whole of the winter months, taking no food during the time. They take no carbon and nitrogen from the air and extract no minerals and nitrates from the soil. Metabolism is practically non-existent during this period. The cessation of the flow of sap in trees during the winter season is similar to the almost ceasing of circulation in hibernating animals. Plants like the daffodil, onion, beet, turnip, etc. store up large supplies of food in their roots, bulbs, and tubers during the summer. Their tops die off in the late fall or early winter, and they lie dormant during the long winter, only to send up new stems and leaves when spring arrives. The storing up of food in their roots is similar to the storing of fat by the bear. Hibernation in animals. Hibernation is common among insects and is seen in every group of vertebrae except birds, which substitute migration for hibernation. It is largely found in insect and vegetable-eating species. Hibernation occurs regularly throughout the winter in such invertebrates as snails, crustaceans, myriapods, insects, arachnids, and the lower vertebrates such as reptiles, amphibians, and some freshwater fishes. Many mammals inhabiting the colder regions, especially species living on the ground or whose principal sources of food are unavailable in the winter, are known to hibernate. And such hibernating animals as the bat, ground squirrel, marmot, hedgehog, or dormouse, the temperature of the body drops from its typical warm condition to one of 2 degrees centigrade above that of the surrounding air. In maximum dormancy, the heart rate is slowed considerably, sometimes to only 1 or 2% of the normal heart rate. The respiratory movement drop off to similar extent, and determination of oxygen consumption indicates a reduction to as low as 3 to 5% of normal consumptions. During hibernation, the animal may not feed, depending entirely upon the stored food reserves within his body. The evidence at hand indicates that in such cases, the body weight may drop as much as 50%. In other cases, food is stored within the winter nest, and the hibernating animal awakens from time to time to consume its food. In winter, there are periods of fasting in those animals that hibernate only in a limited sense. Mice and squirrels, for example, that store food for the winter, often sleep for days at a time without ceasing. Hibernation by bears. The bear is a typical hibernator, although not all bears hibernate. For example, the American grizzly bear does not. In the Himalayan or Asiatic black bear, hibernation is not complete, as the bear comes out on warm winter days to feed. The brown bear, on the other hand, hibernates. In several species of bear, only the female dens up in winter and appears to undergo a partial hibernation, during which the young are born. The young cubs and the emaciated mother emerging in the spring. The polar bear is an example of this kind. The black bear, native to North America, give birth to 2 or 3 cubs while hibernating. At birth, these cubs are naked and blind and are but 8 inches long. Hibernating bears are believed not to attain full dormancy. The big black bear of northern Russia retires to a bed of leaves and moss about the end of November and sleeps, if not disturbed, until about the middle of March, living during this time upon the nutritive supplies stored in his own tissue. The fat or well-fed bear will begin to fast some weeks before he retires to his den for his long winter sleep. Disturb him in the latter part of February, and he will instantly awaken and alert and will attack the intrudent with a fury which has given rise to the expression as savage as a wicked winter bear. Hibernation in rodents. Nearly all the burrowing rodents hibernate. Notable exceptions are gophers, chipmunks, and squirrels, which store up roots and nuts on which they feed when an occasional warm day induces them to arouse. On the colder days, even these hibernate. The prairie dog and squirrel are said to be partial hibernation. In the northern part of his range, the badger hibernates during the winter. He passes through a long winter without eating. After an absolute fast of 10 weeks, he will trot for miles in search of acorn or roots, which he may then be forced to dig out of the half-frozen ground. The dormouse, sleeping mouse, a term applied to the Old World to a small squirrel-like rodent. In the U.S., to the common white-footed mouse, is a long sleeper, but seems not to sleep as deeply nor to be as far from consciousness as some other hibernating mammals. He makes himself very comfortable by weaving a thick network of dry grass into his winter bedclothes. This is so neatly and skillfully designed that it keeps in the heat and yet permits a fair amount of airflow to filter through. So carefully does he fill up the hole in his warm light wrapping after he goes inside. There is no hint of a joint or a weak place. Here he spends a long time of 5 months in deep sleep with no food and often loses more than 40% of his weight during this period. Hibernation among bats. The hibernating habits of different species of bats differs so much that it's difficult to generalize. There is some evidence that some bats migrate upon the approach of winter, but most of them hibernate. Bats live on winged insects. Winged insects and must catch their prey in the air. Their feeding days are limited except in the south, where insects fly about for a longer season. Indeed, their feeding days must be very short if frost comes early in autumn. Their period of hibernation may be more than half a year. Their death-like inactivity is made necessary because of the need to make their meager supply of stored food hold out over such a long period of time. In the long winters of the north, hibernation often means going without food for 5, 6, and 7 months. If bats are to survive, it is essential that their food resources be made to hold out as long as possible. Bats cluster in masses, usually in caves, old barns, and other places that offer protection from the inclemencies of winter. The hibernating bat appears in all respects dead. Its temperature sinks very low, its heart beats so feebly it is barely perceptible, and it takes long to awaken from its sleep. One naturalist describes the winter sleep of bats in the following words: most bats, when fallen into their winter sleep, look dead as nearly as may be. They grow cold, and their heart beats feebly, and when they hang themselves head downward on some dusty beam or crouch in some smoldering wood, they might be taken for lumps of leather. Nothing about them suggests a living creature, and no one would imagine for a moment that they would presently be flying with a dash and a skill and a command of quick turns beyond the power of a bird. Griffin says of the hibernating bats, the heart rate slows to a point where it cannot be detected. Breathing almost ceases. The blood moves sluggishly. The body temperature falls almost to that of the surroundings. Bat hibernating in a cave where the air temperature is 33 degrees Fahrenheit may have a body temperature of 33.5 degrees Fahrenheit. They feel cold to handle and are stiff and unresponsive. It requires close observation to distinguish a hibernating bat from a dead one. There is evidence that bats may awaken spontaneously during the winter and fly around in their cave, even in rare instances flying considerably distance to other caves. Griffin says that they are not continually dormant throughout the whole winter. On successive visits into the same cave, we usually found the bats in different parts of the passages, even where they were not disturbed on the previous visit. Probably they wake up from time to time and fly about a bit, perhaps occasionally wandering out of the cave to see whether spring has come yet, and then hang themselves up again for another long sleep. Flying from cave to cave in winter seems to be a rare occurrence, but we obtained 3 returns of branded bats which have flown 55 to 125 miles from one cave to another during a single winter. Hibernation in cold-blooded animals. While the hibernating mammals seek caves, dens, or hollow logs, usually making themselves dens of dry leaves or grass to sleep throughout the winter, the lower orders remain buried throughout the winter with the body temperature. The body temperature approximately that of the external environment and with great decrease in metabolism. Reptiles hide away among stones or pits or caves, often coiling together to form a huge inert mass. Frogs, lizards, salamanders, and certain fishes bury themselves in the earth below the reach of frost. The aquatic forms digging into the mud at the bottom of the stream. The few fishes which are known to lie dormant and take no food sink into the mud of the streams or of the sea. Some fish, as the carp, lie quiet or on mud bottom. The horseshoe crab buries into the mud beyond the reach of oyster dredges in November, remaining in deep water until the middle of spring. Because snakes hibernate so deep below the ground that frost never reaches them, they live further north than any other reptile. Spiders and snails hibernate under stones, moss, etc., while slugs bury themselves in the mud, and mussels and other mollusks living in the streams and lakes descend into the mud. As cold weather comes and winter approaches, the purely aquatic species of frogs takes to the water and burrow into the moist mud at the bottom of the ponds below the frost line. Here they hibernate throughout the winter, becoming cold and dormant where the climate is severe, until revived in the spring. Others bore into the soil or beneath the fallen leaves or into the rotting stumps, etc., and exist quietly and dormant until the coming of warm weather and food. During this period, most of the life activities of the frog cease. The heart beats very slowly, and there is little evidence of life. The frog the frog does not breathe through its lungs during this period, but takes an oxygen throughout its skin. Toads also hibernate throughout the winter. Hibernating frogs and toads take no food, being dependable during this time on the food reserves stored in their bodies as fat and glycogen. All activities are suspended except those necessary to maintain life, such as the beating of a heart. Metabolism is much reduced. Little oxygen is required, and respiration takes place entirely throughout the skin. Many other amphibians bury themselves in mud, this being particularly true of those that estivate during the dry season. Lizards residing in the temperature zones hibernate during the winter here in the Southwest. The great variety of lizards, some brilliant colored, others dull and drab, like the noted horned toad that one sees in summer months, is also almost bewildering. Upon the approach of winter, they disappear. They may be found under boards, piles of straw, logs, etc., dormant and almost incapable of activity. If placed near a fire and made warm, they become as active as in the summer months. Newts are more difficult to find than lizards, but if one digs into the hole, often far down into the ground, where a newt is spending the winter, one may find a black shriveled object that is scarcely recognizable. The snail prepares a really tough defense for itself. It seeks a hiding place, preferring a damp and rather warm atmosphere, and when ensconced in its new home, manufactures from its own juices a chalky secretion covering the mouth of its cells. By puffing from its lungs, it separates this covering from contact with itself. This defensive covering porous to the air so that the sleeping snails can breathe. It then shrinks into the deep recesses of its shell instead of filling out the whole of it. Here it spends the winter in sleep, taking no food during the whole of this period. hibernation of insects. Most insects hibernate in the larva or pupa stages. The larva, many caterpillars hatch in summer and sleep all winter. A few insects, as certain moths, butterflies, and beetles, hibernate in the adult stage. Caterpillars hide under moss, the bark of trees, etc., but they freeze solid and may be broken into pieces like an icicle. They gradually thaw out in the spring, but when the changes are sudden, great numbers die. In Europe, insects pass the winter not as adults, but in the pupa stage, where wrapped up in the cocoon. The queen bumblebee makes for herself a hole in the ground, the sides of which she polishes very thoroughly. She goes into the winter home in early October and does not come out for 5 months or more. She shifts her position and has moments of restlessness, but does not take food. She sleeps thoroughly all or most of her period of hibernation. Queen wasps, though preferring a hole behind a piece of loose bark or in the wood of a decaying tree, employ a greater variety of hiding place than does the bumblebee and retire in September. They are wide awake and active if the weather becomes warm. Well, family, I'm expecting somebody. They're going to help me for like an hour with something I have to do. So I'm going to come back at 9 o'clock. But you guys tell me, do you want me to keep reading this? Which I'm going to do like tomorrow too. I'm going to finish this, but like it was supposed to be earlier today, but I kind of got like left. If things, you know how it goes. But, so do you want me to continue reading this tonight? Because I'll be going back 9 o'clock Eastern time, which is about an hour and like 7 minutes. But do you want me to go back to this? Or we already finished up, Yes, he knows our heart, but do we know his heart? And we did Jeremiah, so I'm going to be starting Ezekiel. So do you want me to start that at 9, or do you want to wait until tomorrow night? So you guys let me know in the comments. I love you guys. And yeah, this is it gets really good. But I just want everything, because who knew that about all these animals, And I love you guys, and I'll talk to you soon. Shalom.